want to sit here and say that God gives his toughest battles to his strongest soldiers. But a couple of months ago, and by a couple of months ago, I mean 11 months ago, I was sat in this very chair, in this very room, talking about the very manga we're talking about today. And 11 months ago, while Gojo and Sukuna were locked in what would actually become the last chapter of their battle, I sat down and began to ponder about how this battle against Sukuna could truly come to its end. Somewhat ironically, when I posted this video talking about the end of the battle against Sukuna and how Nobara would play a massive role in it, unfortunately, the second we posted it, the leaks came out that showed that Gojo had been cut in half, and therefore my news kind of disappeared immediately. In this video, 11 months ago, I sat down and filmed a 27-minute video about why Nobara will play a crucial part in the defeat of Sukuna. I talked about her soul resonance ability, how the last finger of Sukuna wasn't accounted for, and how, more likely than not, the reason that we hadn't seen Nobara again in the manga is because the Kusakabe Coalition and the rest of the Jujutsu Society was trying to keep her away from Yuji. And you know what I got? You know what I got for filming that video a year ago? Well, outside of everybody pointing out the fact that I posted a video about Sukuna's defeat literally the day that Gojo got cut in half, everyone said I was taking big old hits of the copium. And you know what? Maybe I was, because I've established time and time again that Nobara is my favorite character in JJK. There's a reason she's the only JJK character I have a tattoo of. I like her so much I put her face in the pit of my elbow. You know how much that hurts? And then you have to spend an entire week not bending your arm, because if you do, you'll crease the tattoo. The only other person I did it with was with Gon, my second favorite anime character of all time. And thus people said, oh, Nick, your bias is showing through here. Of course you want Nobara to come back into the story. Nick, it's been 200 chapters. She's gone. But no, I kept the flame alit. I championed for her return, and look at me now, basking in the glory of my wealth and riches. Because while it was an absolutely massive week for JJK, as things like the fact that there's only 5 chapters of this manga left were revealed by Gege, and it was featured on the front page of Shonen Jump with a color spread with some of the most important characters in the manga putting dogs on their head for some reason, by far and away the most important thing that happened in this chapter was the return of a certain YouTuber's favorite character. However, that's not all that happened. We also got exposition on how Sukuna's last finger ended up in whatever weird domain expansion thing Yuji and Sukuna are currently in. We learned how Yuta was able to get the dismantle. We got a massive exposition dump on how Rika's copy technique works, and we got to see what could possibly be the final Black Flash in JJK. There is literally so much to talk about here and so much pretty complicated information to unpack that I should stop yapping about being correct and get into this chapter review. Because today we're talking chapter 267 of JJK Explained. But before we get to explaining anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you want to see me try to bring real-life challenges to the anime world, go ahead and follow the brand new channel that I just created with Stephen He, Chris Barnett, and Danny Mata called Anime IRL. Or if you just want to hear me talk about anime and manga, go ahead and follow my anime podcast, Otaku's Anonymous, where me and Danny Mata break down everything that happened in anime and manga this week. It's available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. So, chapter 267 of JJK. The beginning of the end. It was revealed a couple of days ago, even prior to the leaks coming out, that we were only going to be having 5 more chapters of JJK, which means that JJK will end on chapter 272. 271, I can't count. And since JJK is the biggest manga in the world and is now apparently ending, Shonen Jump is really doubling down with their love of JJK, as JJK was shown on the cover of Shonen Jump, and we're given a color spread of Gojo, Yuji, Megumi, and Nobara, all with dogs on their heads. Gojo had a beagle, Yuji had a pug, Megumi had a Shiba Inu, and Nobara had I don't really know what it is actually. Like, it looks like a mini lab or like a mini golden retriever. I have no idea. But the actual chapter itself starts with a flashback. And for those of you who are still waiting on Gojo's return, don't worry, he's back again. He never went anywhere. He's in every chapter. But the chapter starts with Gojo and Yuta doing switch training. So Gojo is in Yuta's body and Yuta is in Gojo's body. And thus the chapter opens with Gojo in Yuta's body asking Yuta, "You want me to give you Sukuna's last finger?" To which Yuta responds by saying, "I do. You're hiding it somewhere, right? If you let Rika-chan eat it, I can copy the shrine." Yuta goes on to say, "Even if we've swapped bodies like this, I can't read your memories." Which shows that Wee Wee's body swapping technique doesn't necessarily work like Kenjaku's body swapping technique. Because if Yuta's brain was inside of Gojo's body, like it kind of is right now, actually. Yuta would be able to access Gojo's memory and find out where Gojo hid the finger. However, Gojo hears this relatively good idea from Yuta and simply says, Gojo says, sure, that would meet the conditions of your technique. After all, one of Sukuna's fingers is a 20th of Sukuna. But if you want to analyze the shrine and its techniques, that won't be enough. And Yuta concurs with this, saying that if I didn't have Inumaki to help me with figuring out how cursed speech worked, there's a ton I wouldn't know. We then see in a flashback that Inumaki is telling Yuta that cursed speech can work through a phone, which is how we got the moment in Yuta's body of him using cursed speech through a recording that Inumaki had recorded previously. Gojo then goes on to say that I don't think it's a good idea to lose our connection to Sukuna here, and that's foreshadowing. Gojo then goes on to say, let me put it how Hikari would put it, and bringing up Hikari's name in the last 5 chapters when we haven't seen Hikari in 20 or so chapters, and we're running out of time for him to close up his battle against Durame is kind of cruel, Gege. But Gojo says, let me say it how Hikari would say it. Let's make a gamble. The fever, or something like that, is what he says. Now, to this point, that we get real deep on how Rika's copy technique works. For like, and I'm possibly gonna be too jaded here, really no reason. Like, we spent like 3.5 pages explaining how Rika's copy technique works, when Yuta is in Gojo's body not being haunted by Rika and is already possibly dead. Gojo then goes on to say, if you want to copy Shrine, Yuta then interrupts him and says, if I want to have Rika-chan copy a technique, she has to ingest a portion of somebody's body. How much she ingests in what part of the body depends on the target, and the amount of times I'd want to use the technique. And this is brand new information. Yuta says, think of it like this. On a normal sorcerer, I'd have to take more than a fatal amount from their body to use a stronger technique of theirs. That is to say that if Yuta is trying to have Rika copy an incredibly powerful curse technique like body swapping from Kenjaku, Rika has to consume a fatal amount of the person in question. However, if she doesn't ingest a lethal amount of the person, he can make a binding vow with himself to only use the curse technique a proportionate amount of times. And thus this is largely implying, once again I'll say a little bit too late, that more likely than not, because Yuta only consumed 2 fingers from Yuji, that he was only able to use the shrine, things like dismantle and cleave, a certain amount of times, which is possibly why we only see him use it the one time against Sukuna to catch him off guard, and to possibly bait Sukuna into believing that he had consumed Sukuna's last finger. Yuji then comes in and says, but what if they use reverse curse technique? Let's say hypothetically you bite what would be a fatal amount from some sorcerer's body and then they heal it. Would you be able to cheat the copy technique then? And it's at this point that we get a bunch of chibi drawings of Gojo getting his arm bitten off by Rika. So Yuji asks, if you were to hypothetically bite off Gojo's arm to copy the Limitless and then have him regrow it, would you be able to copy the Limitless without killing Gojo? I was gonna say Gojo Sensei, and then I was like, I don't need to say Gojo Sensei, so I just ended on Gojo. Yuji then goes on to say you could copy the techniques of Gojo and Hikari this way. But Yuta tells him that's a no-go. The instant that the consumed body part is regenerated, the worth of that body part plummets to essentially 0, and thus the requirements for his copy technique become immediately unfulfilled. Yuta then goes on to say that reverse curse technique in modern medicine will allow for Inumaki and Angel to get their arms back in the future, and thus the reason that neither of them decided to regenerate their arms is because they wanted you to be able to use their curse techniques, which is, once again, brand new information to us. In fact, if I'm not incorrect here, this is actually the first time it's ever been explained to us how Inumaki lost his arm. And to this point that we also see something rather interesting. And it's Hikari with his arm around Charles, the failed manga artist, and it says that Charles is currently without a rib, implying that Charles also gave up a part of his body so that Rika could eat it and Yuta could copy his technique. Now, for those of you who don't remember Charles, can't necessarily say I blame you, but Charles had a really interesting and somewhat convoluted curse technique. A technique called G War Staff. That essentially was a cursed weapon that Charles's innate technique was tied to. A technique that allowed for Charles, if he was able to come into contact with somebody with his G War Staff and draw their blood into his pen, attach a manga panel to the person whose blood he's drawn. And this manga panel basically gives Charles future sight on the movements of that person. And this future sight starts with 1 second, but the more blood that Charles gets, the further in advance he can see. Now, Charles walking around without one rib implies that Yuta probably has this cursed technique, though we never saw him use it. And that's interesting and possibly something to keep an eye on in the future. Though there isn't like a whole lot of future left, and I highly doubt Yuta will be involved in any of it, especially in his own body with Rika. So maybe it's just a weird addition. I don't really know what Gege's going for here. Now, Meme realizes and says out loud that we're revealing a whole lot of our plan to Yuji, and brings up the fact that Toto believes that Sukuna and Yuji still have resonance, and that how revealing how copy works to Yuji might be revealing how copy works to Sukuna. However, Yuta says he knows about the resonance, and therefore they're only going to try this strategy that revolves around Yuta and Yuji immediately before they fight Sukuna. But apparently Yuji isn't super listening, because Meme tells Yuta that she's going to figure out what the minimum amount of information she can tell Yuji is, and then key him into what's going on. Yuta then confirms with her by saying that you can never be too careful. But even if their resonance allows for Itadori and Sukuna to detect big physical changes in each other, Sukuna shouldn't be able to tell what Itadori is thinking, or what information he has. To which Meme responds by saying, "You're reasoning," and Yuta responds by saying, "Well, because Yuji doesn't know what Sukuna's thinking." Yuta then goes on to say, if everything is in disarray after Gojo fights against Sukuna, I don't think will be found out. Sukuna won't have time to resonate with Yuji or identify the information that he has. But more than anything, I also don't want to give Yuji an opportunity to lose his composure before his battle against Sukuna. And thus Yuta tells Yuji that even if Yuji doesn't realize it, Sukuna's curse technique is etched into his body. Gojo confirmed it through the use of the Six Eyes. And then in the next page, we see Yuji's hand is missing two fingers that haven't been healed, thus confirming the suspicion that basically everybody had after the conclusion of last chapter, that instead of consuming Sukuna's last finger to get the shrine, Yuta consumed two of Yuji's, which they then covered up with possibly a cursed object in the form of his red blood gauntlet. We never found out what it was. Now, it's at this point that we snap back to the present, where Sukuna is realizing that Yuji is missing his two fingers, and Sukuna realizes that those aren't the fingers that I took when I switched into Megami's body. That was his left pinky, which isn't necessarily for Sukuna, it's more for us, the reader. We then see in a flashback that Sukuna's remembering the battle he had against Yuta, where Yuta is telling Sukuna, you weren't able to retrieve your final finger, were you? Which we now know was done by Yuta to bait Sukuna into believing that the final finger went into Yuta. And it's at this point that Sukuna realizes that it was all a bluff, that Yuta didn't use Sukuna's finger to copy the shrine, but instead Yuji's. And it's at this point that we see that the principal of Kyoto High, Gakuganji is his name, and Urahime are also in this weird domain expansion type thing. And Gakuganji is giving us exposition on Sukuna's final cursed finger, telling us how it can withstand any attack, be it jujitsu based or physical. But he wonders out loud to himself as to whether or not this finger is able to negate cursed techniques. And it's at this point that Urahime hops in and says it's a binding vow. If we make a binding vow that says we're going to stop trying to destroy it and rather just flow cursed techniques through it, then maybe there's something we can do. But there's something I'm more worried about than even that. It hasn't even been a half hour since she woke up. And it's at this point that we get a full page of Nobara holding a nail in her hand with an eye patch, saying, let's see some smiles, boys. Just like that, ladies and gentlemen, she's back! 142 chapters later, and I never once lost my resolve. Okay, a couple times I lost my resolve. But did I not say exactly that the final finger of Sukuna would come into play with soul resonance in a moment when Sukuna was weakened, and Nobara would deliver one of the most decisive and final blows of the battle against the King of Curses? Oh wait, I did say that. I said that exactly. And not only did I say that exactly, I said it a year ago. Because that's the thing. When it comes down to it, I'm the best to do it, the best to ever do it. I always say, theories, I do them the biggest, the grandest. I have the biggest view count on my theories. I don't have a good trump, you can tell. And almost as soon as she's revealed, she gets to action, placing her straw doll directly behind Sukuna's final finger and driving a nail through it. And just like that, Nobara fires her soul resonance technique directly into the heart of Sukuna. Well, not the heart, the metaphorical heart, because she was made for this. Her curse technique was made for this. That's why they got rid of her, because if anybody posed a bigger threat to Sukuna over the course of this story, not named Gojo, it was Nobara. And in the next 2 pages, we get a 2-page spread of nails firing out of Sukuna's chest. And as Nobara yells resonance, we see Sukuna begin to realize that this technique is messing with his ability to expand his own domain. And as he realizes this, he realizes that Yuji's sure hit effect is going to hit him for sure. And Yuji's sure hit effect, as they're still in his domain somehow, is his dismantle, which specifically targets the barrier between Megami and Sukuna's souls. And as Megami has begun to fight back against Sukuna as of last chapter, the new gen Gen Team 7 is now all back together, battling against the King of Curses. And if that's not the most peak goddamn content you've ever read, I don't know what is. We then see that both Nobara and Yuji are cheesing hard, as Nobara points her hammer at Sukuna and says, "How's that for OP, you damn idiot?" And as Sukuna can no longer expand his own domain, Yuji flies in and begins to hit him with as many dismantles as he can, capitalizing on the sure hit factor of his domain. He then smashes Sukuna with a right hook to the face that sends Sukuna reeling. However, Sukuna catches his footing and lands a massive uppercut into Yuji's stomach. And as both of them spit out blood, the true severity and intensity of their battle hits its climax. Sukuna screams at Yuji that this isn't over. Sukuna yells at Yuji, "You think you can flame me with this superficial domain? You haven't even been using reverse curse technique to heal your wounds. You surpassed your limit a long time ago. And the vast amount of cursed energy you've expended within this domain, if anybody has the advantage, it's me." And once again, for the second time in 2 chapters, Sukuna and Yuji are throwing haymakers into each other's face relentlessly, with both of them incurring somewhat severe damage. However, Yuji's able to hit Sukuna with a right hook so strong that it sends him flying backwards. And the reason it was strong enough to send him backwards, even though he thought he dodged it, was the time hit lag effect of Yuji's cursed energy. The first technique that Yuji ever learned. The technique that made him a legitimate threat to people like Mahito. And thus as Sukuna stands there stunned by the thing that technically happened because Yuji wasn't good at controlling his own cursed energy, he looks down and sees that Yuji is loading up a Jaja Ken. And Yuji's saying to Sukuna, "Sukuna, it's time we end this, you ever-revolving curse." And thus Yuji lines up the hardest right uppercut black flash he can muster directly into Sukuna's heart. And the force of this punch is so incredibly great that all of Sukuna's eyes go white. And the last panel of the chapter is Yuji staring at Sukuna with determination in his eyes as the narrator says, "Yuji has rung the bell on a long fight." Meaning, that black flash delivered into Sukuna's chest might have just been the real end. While we've so many times before said, "No, I don't know how Sukuna gets out of this situation," with the news that there's only 5 chapters of JJK left, the reveal that Nobara is back alive and back in the fight, with the reveal of Megami's soul being shook back to consciousness inside of Sukuna as a vessel, and with the reveal of Utahime and Gakuganji staring down on this battle in Yuji's domain over the final finger for Sukuna, it feels as though if this fight isn't over this chapter, it'll be over next chapter. Because when it comes down to it, this story still needs to be wrapped up. And we now only have 4 chapters to do that. While you can absolutely wrap up a manga in 3 or so chapters, I'd like to remind everybody that Yuta's on the ground somewhere inside of Gojo's body. We don't know if it's been 5 minutes. We don't know how Kenjaku's body swapping technique works, so we don't know if Yuta's dead. Hakari and Arame haven't been seen for over 6 months. All of the elders of the Jujutsu Society are dead now, and therefore the aftermath of how the Jujutsu Society is going to work after this battle against Sukuna needs to be explained. We don't know if Megami's soul has given up and therefore Megami will die or retake over Sukuna's body. We don't know if Sukuna being exorcised by the son of his twin brother is going to stop his reincarnation cycle. We don't even know if Takaba is still alive, or Kusakabe, or so many other members of the Kusakabe coalition. And don't even get me started on the merger. For genuinely the first time I've probably ever seen in anime and manga, a worst case possible scenario was introduced and we didn't even get to see any of it. Anime and manga rules dictate that if you're going to introduce a worst possible scenario, you have to at least start it so the good guys can stop it. Ties into the fact that we're not entirely sure what's going on with Tengen and so much more. The prospect of extending this fight any further beyond next week just doesn't seem like a smart move. But also, I'd like to say, ending this manga in 4 chapters is also not a smart move. This is the #1 manga on Earth, and for a long time, Gege has been praised as one of the greatest world builders out there. And I'm gonna come out and say it, and it might be slightly controversial. No, he's not. If this manga ends in 4 chapters, yes, will have what Gege built been incredibly impressive and still one of the greater mangas of all time? Absolutely. But to look at the JJK universe and say that the world building in it is good is unfortunately a stretch. Chainsaw Man, in 170 or so chapters, has established better world building than the entirety of JJK. And that's a story about a horny teen who turns into a chainsaw man. All we ever learned about the elders of the Jujutsu Society is that Gojo didn't like him, and that eventually he killed him. The body swapping technique of Weeb was incredibly convenient and also came out of left field. The concept of cursed corpses was introduced by Panda and the principal and then never really elaborated on. It was kind of just weird, needless, tacked on exposition. The only clan that ever really got any real time in the sun was the Zenin clan, who were cut down in a matter of 3 or so chapters. Arame's role and introduction to Sukuna was never elaborated upon. He's just always been Sukuna's #1 fan. And we never got to the merger. Tengen's real role in the Culling Games was never super explained, and so much else. There could be 50 more chapters in this manga. I get that we're on the precipice of defeating the final big bad, but it feels like we could have taken some time away from fighting against Sukuna for the last year and a half and built out some of the other storylines that we've been working on. So I'm really happy with this chapter, obviously. The news that JJK is gonna finish in 5 chapters just kind of has me reevaluating the quality of this manga. It's still very good, but I wish we had gotten more elaboration on some of the world building aspects. But who knows? Maybe I'm just being a jaded information nerd. I'm curious to hear what you guys think. Do you guys feel like we're being rushed into an ending here when we could have built out what could have been one of the more interesting and filled in and lived in worlds? Or do you think we're just bringing the incredible pacing of JJK to its natural conclusion? Tell me in the comments below. And while you're down there, tell me how you felt about this chapter and the return of Nobara. And also, while you're down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Oh, I figured out you needed 3 souls to live together in a cursed corpse, so one could be the ego, the id, and the superego. Okay, Principal Yaga. Was that information only given to us for Panda?